Hey photographers, if you've got a Sony A7 Mark III and a video shoot, but don't have time to read the manual and fiddle around, here's a quick start guide for video novices. That should take about 5 minutes. Now then, if you have time, stick around for some advanced suggestions and what I do above the basics. I know you're wondering about this tripod. It's the Manfrotto Nitrotech. They've loaned it to me to try it out. The nitrogen piston provides better counterbalance and smoother action. I'll get back to tripods later. I recommend updating to the latest firmware. This video was recorded using version 1.0. And just so you know where I'm starting, I've initialized the camera. These are the default settings. We'll customize as we go. Use an SDXC memory card rated U3, or better. The A7 III supports UHS-2, that's what I'm using, but only in slot 1. UHS-2 is overkill for the video bitrate supported by the Mark III. I'm using a U3 or V30 type card in slot 2. After I back up whatever's on the card, I format the card. A 64GB card holds about 80 minutes of video. Turn the dial to video mode. Now, it's not that you can't shoot video in the other modes, but in video mode, you'll see the video aspect and framing, the audio meters appear, and the settings appropriate for video, along with your custom video button selections, are activated. And while we're here, check that the EV dial is at 0. With 2 card slots, there are some options. Tab 5, Screen 6, Rec Media Settings. Recording mode has options to record video simultaneously on both cards for backup, or to record video on one stills on the other. Turn Auto Switch Media on. Back on Screen 2, set the Auto Pour Off temperature to high. This doesn't stop the overheating icon from appearing, but it will increase the amount of time before it shuts the camera down. Also on Tab 2, Touch Operation, off by default, can be useful for video. And Tab 2, Screen 3, last option, this enables the shutter release to start and stop recording. I find that easier and more intuitive than pressing the red button. On Screen 1, adjust the monitor brightness. This is useful if you're shooting outside on a sunny day. And if you're using a tripod, turn Steady Shot off. If the Tab 2, Screen 4 option's dimmed out, you'll find a switch on the lens, like here on the FE24-105 we're using today. Use Tab 2 Screen 1 to set the exposure mode to manual. It won't really be manual, you'll see in a minute. The A7 III supports both HD and 4K recording. Even if you're creating HD content, I'd shoot in 4K as it's higher quality. After all, that's why you bought the A7 III, and it allows a little more flexibility to crop your shot in editing. In 4K, there are 2 frame rate and 2 data rate options. As most of our display devices use 30 frames, best to use that setting to record. And I'm going with quality, 100 megabits for the data rate. In HD, I'd use 30p50. Whichever you choose, use the back dial to set the shutter speed to 1/60th. Then the front dial to set the aperture for the scene, depending on how much you want the background defocused. A larger aperture, smaller f-number, will blur the background, as long as you keep your subject close to the camera. I generally shoot my on-camera scenes at f4. By default, we're in Auto ISO, even if we've selected manual exposure mode, and that keeps things simple. But you should tell it how you'd like the light metered. Press Fun, and select the metering mode for the scene. Multi or center weighted works for most situations, but there are 2 sizes of spot, which can be moved. On Tab 1 Screen 10, set the spot metering point to focus point link instead of just center. Now, the spot can be moved with the joystick or using touch. 2 more meter options, entire screen average and highlight, which will keep even the brightest object in the scene from overexposing. And while that's useful in some scenes, like performers on stage, it may underexpose normal scenes where you don't mind a street light or table lamp being overexposed. Press Disp, the top of the control dial, to carousel through the various display options. The histogram can be useful to check exposure. The level shows you the horizontal and vertical positions. Press Fun and select ISO to set the minimum and maximum for the auto ISO. I leave them on the default. If it takes ISO 12.8 to properly expose a scene, I'm fine with that. Now this is the point where you may run into a problem. If you're shooting outside with a shutter of 1/60th and an aperture of f4, the ISO may be flashing, which means it's too bright. The solution is an ND filter. Now I use the Tiffin filter kit, which can be adapted to multiple lens diameters. I find it impossible to shoot outdoors on a sunny day without it. Of course, it's your eyes that provide the final artistic view of the scene. Set the ISO manually to get the look you want. Shooting with manual ISO may also make it easier to edit, as there won't be any exposure changes during the scene. In video mode, there are two focus options, auto continuous or manual. Continuous works well, particularly with expand flexible spot. Use the joystick or touch to select the object. Tab 1 Screen 6, set Face Party in AF to turn face detection on and Face Frame Disp to display a frame around the detected faces. Like Auto ISO, Auto White Balance may make scenes harder to edit, as the camera will make small color balance adjustments during a scene. Pick the setting that seems most appropriate for the scene. Last thing, creative style. This is all personal choice and preference to help you create the right mood or emotion for the scene. Vivid delivers super colors, neutral a more subtle look. And that's a good starting point to do color grading while editing. There are more controls to make further adjustments to any of these presets. And here's where you'll find black and white. Now those settings will provide the maximum return for minimal effort. Press the shutter, or the red button if you didn't customize, and record. The A7 III limits recordings to 2950, so keep your eye on the bottom left corner. If that's not long enough and time's running out, pick an appropriate point in the performance to do a quick stop and start. Now, if you can spare a few more minutes, I'll provide some advanced tips, including two options for slow motion. Here's what I do beyond what I just described. And I will say that, to the extent it makes sense, I do shoot with all the settings, shutter, aperture, ISO, white balance, focus, audio, in manual mode. I set a custom white balance. Use the Fun button to get to the white balance settings. The last option is Set, and then point at something white, or a Pro 18% gray card. Press the center button to capture, and again to save. My preferred creative style is neutral, and I turn down each of the custom settings. These are my personal preferences to reduce the crispy, oversaturated look typical to video. Depending on your lens, you may not be getting the close-ups you want, and there are two ways to get closer. Pros will argue the details of the minor loss of image quality, but let's look past that discussion. Let me show you how it works. You decide if it's appropriate for your shot. The first option, Tab 1 Screen 1, is to crop into the APS-C part of the sensor, also called Super 35mm. This uses the area of the sensor equivalent to the frame of Super 35mm film for a 1.5 times zoom. Also, on Tab 2 Screen 5, there's an option to activate a digital zoom. Let's start with the clear image zoom option, and then use the zoom setting on this screen to set the zoom up to another 2 times. Now if you're going to use this, I recommend you go to Tab 2 Screen 8, and with the Video Custom Key settings, select a button. I use button 3, and then select Zoom on Screen 12. Now press C3, and the zoom control appears. You can adjust while recording, but it doesn't zoom smoothly. Back on Screen 5, there's also a full digital zoom, which goes up to 4 times, but with some loss of quality. And as long as we're setting the custom buttons, I assign button 1 to focus magnifier on Screen 8, and then when I use manual focus, the first press selects the area, the second zooms in to get an accurate focus, third press returns to regular view. Is this a good time to talk about lenses? In general, cinematographers prefer prime lenses. You won't see many zooms in movies. The action on the zoom ring on this lens, the 24-105, is a little stiff to zoom smoothly. But what you might find more distracting is that the lens changes focus as it zooms. Oh, it gets back once you stop, but There are special cinema lenses like Sony's 28-135, which I've used in the past, that are parfocal. They stay in focus as you zoom. Cinema lenses typically also have marked and defined travel focus rings to make it possible to turn to a specific position for accurate focus at a specific distance. Changing focus during a shot is called rack focus, and on the A7 III, I would do that with touch. Then, audio. I would only use the sound recorded on the internal microphones for background ambient sound. I prefer a wireless lapel mic, but if you have a boom operator, that will provide a better quality sound. Set the levels from tab 2 screen 2. With an external mic, I find it's necessary to lower it to about 10. Internal or external, if the meter is flashing to the red, turn it down. For me anyway, a tripod is an essential accessory, and I use it all the time. It keeps the camera steady and enables me to move the camera smoothly. You can buy inexpensive tripods, but just buy a good one at the start because you'll get there eventually. After several rounds of disappointment, I bought the Manfrotto 504 sticks. That's what shooters call the legs of a tripod, and the 504 HD head. That's the part that pans and tilts and holds the camera. Fully extended, these sticks are tall enough to get above the crowd and big enough to be stable and wobble-free. The head is, of course, the interesting part, and it's essential that you can start and end a move, panning, tilting, or both, without an obvious jump. It should be smooth, organic, and barely noticeable. So this Nitro head has some obvious improvements. I love the quick snap in and release plate. Very positive, no awkward sliding, and the tripod action is good. It starts very smoothly. There's pan friction and lock, and a tilt friction, but no lock. So amazing. It just stays put where you let it go. It requires a little adjustment to get the balance right, which I found very easy to do with this light camera. I leave the confirmation sounds on, so I know recording has started and stopped. Tab 2 Screen 9 audio signals can turn them off for silent operation. Pros often use Zebra, tab 2 Screen 6, as an exposure assist. Turn it on, and the stripes show which screen objects are at the selected exposure setting. Settings from 70 to 100 plus are available. 100 makes sure your recording is broadcast legal. Use 70% to set the exposure on white skin in general. If there are faces in your scene, expose for them and let the rest fall, making adjustments using picture profiles as needed. Get to that in a minute. Zebra can be distracting, so assign it to a custom key. I use the left button, Zebra Display Select, to toggle on and off. Zebra Level if you also need to adjust the setting. I use Zebra in conjunction with Manual ISO for full manual control of exposure. Pros also like peaking, tab 1 Screen 13 as a focus assist, set the level and the color. Again, best assigned to a custom button. I used right. Display toggles on and off, level and color if you also want to adjust the settings. Marker, tab 2 Screen 3, can be useful to display a center point, to show framing for a specific aspect ratio, the safe area, or a 3x3 grid. Again, if you're going to use these, assign a custom button to turn it on and off. Note that all three of these appear only on the camera's LCD, not on an external monitor connected to the HDMI. Picture profiles are complex and require more time than we want to spend today. Before we start, tab 5 Screen 1 Gamma Disp Assist should be set to auto if you're using picture profiles. And here are the basics in a simplified form. Tab 1 Screen 12. Profiles are sophisticated, pro-level adjustments that you can make to manage the sensor's response to light. And they're all about personal preference. There's no best, no right one. They're all settings that can help you tell the story and create emotion. There are 10 presets, and just by scrolling through you can see the difference that each makes. Some make shadow areas lighter, some change the dynamic range. Press right to see the individual settings that can be adjusted. The big deal here is gamma, which really is the heart of these adjustments, and the star here is S-log2, a setting that increases the dynamic range, which is the difference between the brightest object to the darkest object in a scene, from about 8 stops to about 12 stops. Shooting in S-log requires adjustments in editing. As we don't have screens that can display those 12 stops, you can decide how you'd like to balance the image using color and exposure management tools while editing. Watch what happens to the histogram when using S-log. Unless you have an extreme dynamic range, your talent is in the shade, the background is in the sun, don't use S-log, as it will reduce the dynamic range unnecessarily, making things look dull. Now, I've tried to explain this more in a video I'll link below. But do use these settings, particularly presets 1, 2, 5, and 6 that use the Cine Gamma settings. You'll find that depending on your scene, one may provide a better exposure range. And although it requires an HLG-aware display, this setting is also useful to images with a large dynamic range.
And then again, this is all personal preference. So I prefer a less saturated video look, and I turn the saturation down to -2. And I'm also not a big fan of the crispy, sharpened video look, so I turn the detail down to -4. So that's a scene that I'm happy with. Now, it is worth noting that even though I did initialize the camera at the beginning, resetting the camera does not reset the picture profiles. Each one of those need to be reset individually.
There are 2 ways to get slow motion on the A7 III. First, switch to HD and use the 120 frame mode. This records at 100 megabits and includes audio.
All right, I take the short rope.
You'll need software to slow it down, and at 30 frames, you'll have enough frames to go to 1/4 speed. And note that because this is only available in HD, these scenes are scaled up to 4K in this video. But Sony also offers an entire mode dial position to S and Q. Tab 2 Screen 1 has settings to select the record setting, which is really the playback frame rate, and the frame rate, which is really the record frame rate. So a frame rate of 120 played back at 30 offers the same slow motion as we just created, but now no audio and a data rate of 16 megabits per second. Oh, and in this mode, the playback length determines how long you can record, so only about 7 minutes at these settings. Not hard to select which I prefer. But S&Q does offer recording frame rates as low as 1 frame, which is a nice time-lapse approximation. And speaking of time-lapse, there is none. Sony used to have a downloadable intervalometer app for time-lapse stills, not supported here. Tab 5 Screen 3 offers an entire panel of HDMI options if you have an external monitor or recorder connected. External recording can be useful if you need a longer record time than 30 minutes and may also provide higher quality. There's an option to display the menu and other screen overlays, but that's not available in 4K, so should be dimmed out here. Sony hasn't been very diligent on this screen. The 2460 switch should also be dimmed, but I'm getting pretty advanced. And speaking of advanced, on screen 3, there are also pro-level timecode options. Tab 3 Screen 1 sets up control with smartphone. Using the Play Memories app, you can select format and mode, select the exposure mode, shutter speed and aperture, ISO and white balance, and then hit record. Granted, that's not as much control as you might like, particularly for focus, but there is a mirror mode for vlogging.
The A7 III's battery lasts over 2 hours, more if you're shooting continuously. But the camera can also be powered using USB as long as there's a charge in the internal battery. It does take quite a bit to overheat the Mark III, and I have no magic to prevent that from happening. I've used tab 6 to create a My menu with video settings. You should too. Now, I hope this helps. I hope your shoot goes well. And I've given some settings without really explaining them. I'm happy to discuss my rationale with you, so I reply to all relevant questions and civil comments. Feel free to subscribe, and then shoot until your memory card is full and your battery is empty.